Okay, so you want to own a medieval shipyard. You can already see it. Keels rising out of the mud like the ribs of whales. The smell of hot pitch and green oak. Hundreds of men swarming a hull, and at the end of it all, launch day, when the thing you built slides into the water and floats, and a captain hands you a purse of gold for a machine that can carry a fortune across an empire. Sell a few of those a year, and you are a rich man. Here's the problem with that picture. The most powerful shipyard the medieval world ever produced never sold a single ship. Not one. It ran at a loss on purpose, every year for centuries. It was owned by nobody you could name because it was owned by a committee. And the man who actually swung the hammer inside it earned less than he could have earned across the canal in a yard half its size. Everything you think you know about this business is upside down. The ships were never the point. So let's build one anyway and find out what it was really selling. We are going to Venice, and the year is around 1420, and the city is at the absolute height of its power. There are two doors in front of you. Behind one is a private yard, a squero, a business you can actually own. Behind the other is the Arsenale, the state shipyard, the largest factory in Europe, and a place no private person could ever buy a piece of. To understand either door, you have to understand both. Because the big one sets the price of everything, and the small one is where you find out whether any of this could make you rich. Start by throwing away the word shipyard because it is hiding the real business. You picture a hull. A hull is maybe 2% of your problem. What you are actually running is a materials empire with a slipway attached. To put one galley in the water, you need seasoned oak for the frame, larch and fir for the planking, tall straight fir for the masts, hemp by the literal ton for the rope, flax for the sails, iron for every nail and bolt and anchor, and pitch and oakum to keep the sea on the outside of the boat. Almost none of that grows in a lagoon. A shipyard in a city with no forest is not really a shipyard. It's a stomach, and it eats the countryside for 100 miles in every direction. Venice understood this earlier and more completely than anyone. The Republic reserved an entire forest, the Montello, in the hills of the mainland and declared its oak the property of the Navy. Not taxed, not licensed, owned. Cut a protected oak without permission, and you were not a woodcutter with a fine. You were a thief stealing warships from the state. That is how early they understood the thing you were about to learn the hard way. Whoever controls the trees controls the fleet, and the fleet is the city. Now, the second thing they invented, and it changed the arithmetic of the whole business. The old way to build a ship was hull first. You laid the planks, shaped the shell by eye, and fitted the skeleton inside it afterward. Slow, wasteful of wood, and impossible to standardize because every hull came out slightly different. The Venetians flipped it. Frame first, build the skeleton to a fixed set of proportions, then hang the planking on it. This sounds like a small technical detail. It is the whole ball game. Because once every galley has the same skeleton, every part that hangs on that skeleton is interchangeable. Oars, benches, masts, rudders, rigging, all cut to standard measure in advance and stacked in warehouses, waiting for a hull to arrive. You have just turned shipbuilding from a craft into a production line, and you did it around 200 years before anyone in England had the idea. Here is what that looked like from the outside. In 1574, the King of France, Henri III, came to Venice, and the Republic threw him a banquet inside the Arsenale. While he ate, they built him a galley. Not a toy, a full war galley laid down, planked, rigged, and floated in the time it took a king to get through dinner. It was theater, obviously. But it was theater that only works if the parts are already made. You cannot assemble a ship during a meal unless 10,000 pieces are already sitting on shelves, numbered, waiting. And that is the detail that costs you everything, and we will come back to it because those shelves full of waiting parts are the most expensive thing in the yard, and nobody ever counts them. The Arsenale was so famous, so much a part of what Venice was, that Dante used it as a metaphor. In the Inferno, written around 1320, he describes a pit of boiling black pitch in hell and reaches for the one image every reader would know instantly. The Venetian arsenal in winter, workers boiling pitch to caulk their unsound ships. When a poet uses your factory to describe hell and assumes the whole country will nod along, you have built something enormous. So how enormous and who paid for it? Here the legend and the ledger part company, and the ledger is more interesting. You will read that the Arsenale employed 16,000 men. It is a wonderful number, and it is almost certainly counting the wrong thing. 16,000 is closer to the entire maritime workforce of Venice, everyone who ever touched a ship. The actual payroll inside the walls, the Arsenalotti, the shipwrights and caulkers and oar makers and sawyers who came through the gate each morning, ran closer to 1,500 to 2,000 in a normal year, swelling to perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 when a war demanded it. By the 17th century, the core of masters and apprentices and laborers was around 3,000. Still, for the pre-industrial world, a workforce of thousands under one management behind one wall was simply unheard of. There was nothing else like it in Europe. Not a cathedral site, not a mine, nothing. And it cost the state a fortune to run. In the 17th century, the Arsenale ran to something like 150,000 ducats a year of public money. At its peak, it could swallow up to a tenth of the entire budget of the Republic. Think about that. 1 in every 10 ducats the government of Venice spent on anything, ambassadors, walls, wars, festivals, went into this one shipyard. And it sold nothing. It generated no sales revenue at all. By any accounting a modern person would recognize, it was a bottomless hole with a wall around it. Which raises the only question that matters. Why would the richest, most commercially ruthless city in Europe pour a tenth of its money, decade after decade, into a factory that never sold its product? To answer that, you have to see the trick. And the trick is the most elegant piece of business machinery in this entire story. Venice did not sell ships. Venice sold voyages. Here is how it worked, and it ran in one form or another for over 200 years. The state built the great merchant galleys in the Arsenale at its own expense. It owned them. And then, once a year, it did not sell them. It auctioned the right to use them, one round trip at a time. The city fixed the routes and the sailing dates in advance, the Muda, the great scheduled convoys to Alexandria, to Beirut, to Constantinople and the Black Sea, to Flanders and London. Then it put each galley up for auction, the Incanto, and the highest bidder won the right to load that galley with the most valuable cargo in the world. Spices, silk, bullion, and sail her out and back under the protection of the convoy. Now here's the part that turns a shipping schedule into a machine for making an aristocracy rich. Only nobles were allowed to bid. That was the whole point. A commoner with money and nerve could not buy his way onto the spice run at any price. The auction was a locked door, and only the men in the Golden Book, the register of Venetian noble families, held a key. So the Arsenale was not really a shipyard producing galleys. It was a device for manufacturing a monopoly and handing it every spring to a closed club of a few hundred families. The ships were the packaging. The product was exclusivity. We even have one of these men's account books. Giacomo Badoer, a Venetian noble, won a galley to Alexandria at the Incanto in 1434, and his ledger survives. You can watch, transaction by transaction, a man turn a state-built ship and a state-run convoy into a private fortune in pepper and cotton. He risked his capital genuinely. The sea did not care about his surname, but the door he walked through to take that risk was a door the state had built, at the state's expense, and bolted shut behind everyone who was not him. So now the 150,000 ducats a year makes sense. The Arsenale was not a business. It was infrastructure the way a harbor is infrastructure, or a road. It lost money the way a road loses money, and it paid for itself the way a road pays for itself, by making a small number of people upstream unimaginably rich and taking a cut of everything that moved. The shipyard's customer was the Republic, and what the Republic was buying was not galleys. It was the certainty that when the convoy sailed in spring, it sailed fully found, on time, every time, and that only the right people were aboard. Fine. Say you accept all that. What does one of these ships actually cost to make? Because this is where the dead money lives. The firmest numbers we have come straight out of the Venetian Senate's own accounting. To build one small galley, the state reckoned it needed the continuous labor of 20 skilled men for an entire year, and the whole thing came to around 8,000 ducats. 8,000 ducats and 20 man-years for the small model. The great galleys and the war galleys ran to several times that. The biggest could cost on the order of tens of thousands of ducats each, a floating fortune before it ever earned a coin. And when the Senate finally broke the cost down component by component, the detail is almost comic. The oakum alone, the tarred fiber jammed into the seam so the ship does not drink the Adriatic, cost 450 ducats for a great galley. The iron fittings, nails, and bolts and braces close to 2,800. The anchors, just the anchors, 690 ducats a set, weighing thousands of pounds. You are not building a boat. You are assembling a small mountain of the most expensive commodities in the Mediterranean and hoping it floats. But the real cost, the one that never shows up as a line in anyone's book, is the one we flagged earlier, the waiting parts. To pull off the trick of building a galley in a day, the Arsenale kept a standing inventory that staggers the imagination. Historians and visitors describe stockpiles on the order of 5,000 rowing benches, 15,000 oars, 100 masts, 300 sails, all sitting in warehouses, finished, numbered, and doing absolutely nothing. That is capital frozen solid. Every oar in that pile is money that was spent on timber, on a craftsman's day, on storage, and that earns you not one ducat until a hull shows up to carry it. It is the price of readiness. A shipyard that can build a fleet in a season is, most of the time, a very expensive warehouse full of parts for ships that do not exist yet. And in the war of 1537 to 1538, that expensive warehouse justified itself. The Arsenal turned out something like 50 galleys in 10 months. It could only do that because it had been paying quietly for years to have all the pieces already made. Readiness is not free. Readiness is the single largest thing you are buying, and you buy it in the years when nothing is happening. Now let's talk about the men, because the labor economics here break every rule you would expect. The Arsenalotti were not desperate. They were an aristocracy of labor, a caste apart, recorded in their own official register the way the nobles were recorded in theirs. They guarded the Doge, they guarded the treasury and the mint. When the great bell in the Campanile of St. Mark's rang out the start and end of the working day for the entire city, it was called the Marangona, named after the Marangoni, the Arsenal's carpenters. An entire city set its clock by the shipwright's shift. That is status you cannot buy. And here is the strange part. They were paid less than they could have earned in the private yards across the water. Less. So why did they stay? Because the state was not really paying them in wages. It was paying them in certainty. Lifetime employment. One of the earliest pension systems anywhere in Europe, where a man too old to lift a plank still came to the gate every Saturday and got paid for turning up. Free or subsidized housing in the Castello district around the walls, tax breaks, and wine, an almost unbelievable quantity of wine brought in daily to keep the workforce content. By the 17th century, flowing from a fountain that could pour something like 10 liters a minute, working out to a couple of liters per man per day. The deal was never about the daily rate. The deal was, give up the upside, and we will make sure you never fall. Which produced exactly the problem you would predict. When you pay men simply for appearing, some of them appear and do nothing else. The records are full of it. Men who crossed the gate, got marked present, collected the pay, and left to do private work for private clients, sometimes using the Arsenal's own timber and the Arsenal's own tools. Materials walked out. The gate, constantly. The old and the infirm dragged themselves across the threshold once a day purely to be counted. By 1633, the Senate was so exasperated it passed a rule that an Arsenalotto had to actually be present at least 150 days out of 250 to keep his place. Read that the right way and it tells you the disease. They had to legislate showing up because the pay was detached from the work. That is the permanent tax of guaranteed employment. And Venice paid it for centuries because the alternative, losing the skilled core, was worse. And they knew it was worse because the workers knew their own value. In 1569, a cut to working hours set off a riot inside the walls. The state again and again backed down. When your entire naval power, your empire, your independence rests on maybe a few thousand pairs of expert hands, those hands own you a little, and everyone in the room knows it. The caulkers especially, the men who sealed the hulls, held critical skills. A badly caulked galley drowns its crew, so caulkers were routinely posted aboard ships to make emergency repairs at sea. You do not push a man too hard when his mistake is the difference between a voyage and a mass grave. So that is the great door, the Arsenale. A state-owned, loss-running, monopoly manufacturing engine crewed by a pampered and slightly ungovernable labor aristocracy. Now open the small door, because this is the one you were actually asking about. Can you get rich owning a private yard? You can own a squero. Plenty of Venetians did. The private yards built the round ships, the fat cargo carriers, the navi that hauled the bulk goods the sleek galleys were too precious and too narrow to bother with, and they took overflow and contract work when the state needed it. This is a real business you can hold in your own name. But look at what you are up against. Across the water sits a competitor with an entire forest, a guaranteed workforce, and the government's treasury behind it. To get skilled men, you have to pay more than the Arsenale does, because the only thing you can offer that the state can't is a better daily wage. You cannot match the pension or the wine fountain or the lifetime security. So your labor costs are structurally higher than the giants right out of the gate. And your materials come with no forest attached. Every plank you buy on the open market against a state that has first claim on the best timber in the territory. In a good year, this still works. A fat contract comes in from a merchant who needs a cargo hull, or from the state itself when the Arsenale is overloaded. Your wage bill is covered, your yard is full, and the margin on a well-built ship in a trading city at the height of its power is real money. A private builder who runs a tight yard, keeps his slipways full, and lends his skill out shrewdly can live very well. Not spice monopoly well, but well. Now run the bad year, because the bad year is the whole story of this industry, and it does not arrive as a fire or a war. It arrives as a slow, quiet fact about trees. From the middle of the 15th century, Venice began to run out of wood. Not suddenly, gradually, unstoppably. The accessible oak, the larch, the fir, the timber close enough to float or cart to the lagoon cheaply was being cut faster than it could grow back. The Republic did everything a modern state would do. It reserved forests, it banned cutting, it regulated, surveyed, planted, and threatened. None of it worked because you cannot legislate a 200-year-old oak into existing in 50. By the middle of the 16th century, most of the oak going into privately built Venetian ships had to be bought from outside Venetian territory altogether. The single greatest advantage the whole city had, control of its own timber, was bleeding away one felled tree at a time. And when your raw material gets more expensive every decade and you are already paying higher wages than your state-backed rival, your cost per ship only ever goes one direction. Then came the people who finished the job, and they did not do it with a fleet or a cannon. They did it with a boring cargo ship. The Dutch. Up north, the Dutch had cheap access to Baltic timber, and worse for you, a completely different design philosophy. The famous Floyd was not beautiful. It was not fast. It carried no honor and won no battles. It was a plain, cheap, boxy hull designed to do one thing: carry the maximum cargo with the minimum crew, and it was built with labor-saving methods on cheap wood. And it undercut everyone. The proud Venetian tradition, the frame-first precision, the master shipwrights who built by eye and passed their secrets father to son, the quality obsession that put the Arsenale's name in the mouth of Dante, all of it was, in pure cost terms, beaten by a Dutch bathtub. The most sophisticated shipbuilding culture in the world was undersold by people who had simply decided that cheap and adequate beats excellent and expensive when what you are actually selling is freight per ducat. That is the deepest trap in this whole business, and it is worth saying plainly. A shipyard is a machine for converting timber, skill, and time into ships. If your timber gets dear, your skill gets expensive, and someone else finds a way to need less of both, no amount of tradition or genius saves you. The Venetians did not forget how to build ships. They built them better than anyone right to the end. They just could no longer build them cheaply, and cheap was what the market had quietly started buying while they were busy being the best. The other ways to die were faster and louder, and they were always waiting. Your yard is, physically, a bomb. It is stacked with seasoned timber, tarred rope, barrels of pitch, oil, and increasingly gunpowder, because the Arsenale made the cannons too. In 1508, the gunpowder store blew up and killed a crowd of workers and wrecked part of the complex. There was no insurer coming the following week with a check to rebuild. The same qualities that made the place productive, everything flammable in one dense square, made it a permanent candidate for catastrophe. And above all, that sat the slowest killer of the lot. The galley itself was going obsolete. The sleek oared warship that the whole Arsenale existed to produce was being replaced by the sailing ship bristling with guns. The great Christian victory at Lepanto in 1571, the last enormous galley battle in history, was in a way the galley's funeral. Venice even fielded a monstrous hybrid there, the galleass, a galley grown huge and given a broadside of cannon, a brilliant, awkward creature that was really the shape of a fleet caught between two eras. You can be the finest maker of a thing in the world and still be the finest maker of a thing the world is about to stop wanting. So who actually got rich? Walk the yard one last time and count the fortunes, because it is not who you would guess. It is almost never the man who built the ship. The master shipwrights, the true stars, the men whose skill the state guarded like a treasure, earned status, respect, a bell named after their trade, and a comfortable, secure life. They did not, as a rule, die rich. Their pay sat below the private yards. Their reward was esteem and security, and those do not compound into dynasties. The private squero owner made a living, sometimes a good one, but he was running uphill against the state his whole career. The workers got the pension and the wine and the pride. None of them got the pepper money. The pepper money went to the men who never touched a plank. It went to the few hundred noble families who held the keys to the Encanto, who bid on the galleys the shipyard built and the convoys the state protected, and turned a locked auction into 2 centuries of the richest trade on earth. The shipyard's real product, remember, was their monopoly, and they were the ones who cashed it. And above even them, the entity that got richest of all was the one that never appears on a wage roll, the Republic itself. Venice took a factory that lost money every single year and converted its output into an empire, colonies across the eastern Mediterranean, a stranglehold on the spice trade, a lagoon of merchants who ran Europe's finances, and a run of dominance so long that we are still talking about it. The ledger of the Arsenale showed a loss forever. The balance sheet of Venice showed the best investment a city ever made. And every one of them is gone now. The galley is a museum piece. The Arsenale stopped building the fleets of empire. Parts of it are a naval base, and parts host an art show. The Republic itself fell to Napoleon in 1797 and never came back. The timber ran out, the Dutch won the freight war, the routes moved to the Atlantic, and the whole magnificent machine wound down. But look at what outlived it. Not the ships, which rotted or burned or sank. What survived was everything the ships had been converted into on the way past. A city that still floats, quite literally, on the reputation those galleys built. The idea of the production line, borrowed and reborrowed for 500 years. And the oldest lesson in the trade, the one that was true in the lagoon and is true in every yard, factory, and boardroom since. You thought you were opening a shipyard. You thought the business was building ships and selling them to kings. But the greatest shipyard in the medieval world never sold a ship, lost money for centuries on purpose, and made its owner the master of an empire. Because a medieval shipyard was never really in the business of building ships. It was in the business of certainty and exclusivity, guaranteeing that the fleet would be there in the spring, fully found and on time, and that only the right hands would ever hold the oars. The ships were just the most expensive way anyone ever found to sell those two things. And when the last galley slid off the last slipway, certainty and exclusivity were the only things left standing. You were never the shipbuilder. You were the man who decided who got to sail.